Since time immemorial, indigenous people have lived, traveled, and traded in the Puget Sound region. The Donation Land Act of 1850, to encourage westward expansion, allowed American settlers to claim these traditional native lands. The explosion of immigration into the region that followed forced the U.S. government into a fraught treaty-making process with local tribes. The original terms of the Medicine Creek Treaty were inadequate and ultimately unaccepted by tribal leaders, resulting in war. The Indigenous Voices podcast is an extension of the award-winning Puget Sound Treaty War Panel series and Fort Nisqually Living History Museum. The podcast advances tribal voices in the telling of Puget Sound history and shares tribal knowledge and expertise with wider audiences. Hello, my name is Warren KingGeorge. I'm an enrolled member of the Muckleshoot Indian tribe on my father's side, and on my mother's side, I descend from the Upper Skagit tribe.
Nettsie Bullchild, Nisqually Indian tribe, Director of Archives and Tribal Historic Preservation Office, tribal member, and tribal elder.
Haslachel, Togalapo, Deisha, Desiyaya Chulup, Brandon Reynon Titsta, Squalup Chud, Duflalut Debati, Director / THPO. My name is Brandon Reynon. Welcome. I am the Director and THPO for the Puyallup Tribe of Indians. I'm also a Puyallup tribal member.
Haslachel, Takablu Sitsta, Spuyallup Chud. Good day. My name is Takablu. I'm from the Puyallup tribe. My English name is Amber Taylor. I am the daughter of Eric Bennett and Carol Taylor, the granddaughter of Ramona Bennett, Clyde Bill, Patricia Taylor, and Al Taylor.
My name is Charlene Krise. I am from Squaxin Island tribe. My ancestry is of the Medicine Creek Nation. My family has connections to Nisqually and to Puyallup. I work as the executive director for the Squaxin Museum Library Research Center.
The United States boarding school program was designed to strip Native children of their culture by isolating them from their families and placing them into militant-style religious boarding schools. Our second and third episodes discuss two schools in particular, the Puyallup Indian School located on Squaxin Island and the Cushman Indian School located in Tacoma. This is part one of a two-part episode.
Why is a good, deep question. It's one that I know as I've studied all that went on in the boarding schools is that exact question is why? What was the purpose? Why was the education that we've been having for 14,000 years plus? Why was that not good enough? Why did we need this education? And why did some of our ancestors choose to send their kids to these places? Why were they being forced to go to these places? So you look at the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, on their walls was kill the Indian, save the man. And that was a notion that was passed on and became the mission of every boarding school from coast to coast into Canada as well. So why, from the U.S. government perspective, that's why they wanted to. This was genocide. Nothing, you can't call it anything else. The purpose of the boarding schools for the Native American boarding schools was genocide. Under the guise of educating the natives so that they could live a prosperous life like us. We needed to be made like them, in their eyes. You couldn't be a human unless you were a Christian, unless you spoke English, unless they could communicate with us, right? So the why was to kill us. The why was to make sure that we as a tradition and a culture no longer survived. But that begs the question again, when I started out, why? Why did the non-natives think that we couldn't survive? Why did they think that we were unhuman because we didn't speak English and because we lived on the land and lived for the land, cared for the land. We had families, they had families. Why were their families better than our families? We had religion. Why was their religion better than our religion? Why was their God better than our creator? Right? So the why is very, very good. It's a very strong question. And I don't have a single answer for it. I don't think any of us have an answer as for why, but we know the result.
Well, and we also learned from the treaty. It was all about the land, and that's the other part of it is, they wanted the land. So what was the best way to do it? It was to really like that destroy the tribal people's identity. So you couldn't hunt and fish where you were supposed to. You couldn't gather. You couldn't. All this stuff was destroyed. And so, then you go to the reservations, and on the reservations, what happened, you're supposed to, take up to be civilized. You're supposed to take up farming, go to school. And so it was all a part of taking away the identity, getting the land, the assimilation, you're supposed to be civilized according to their criteria, which really, like I feel when the settlers came, some of them that did come, they were really respectful to the tribal people. But, like when the treaty happened and the war and everything, they just heard what they wanted to hear. There was, to get all of this stuff, you were made to be afraid. And, you were afraid of some of these Indians that worked for you, with you, alongside you, and they weren't that way, but that's what it became. And so, because of that, it's that same old thing, divide and conquer. So now you've got this war going on because they weren't understanding either side. They weren't understanding. Tribes weren't trying to go after them. They just didn't want to give up the land that they, survived on. And like I said, Leshai said that my people won't survive if they're not where they need to be. So with all of that, these people get into this, well, this is how we get that land. This is how we get what we want by taking all that stuff away from them, and if they can't take care of it, like their laws, and I think we talked about this, it was a lot of the federal government making up all of these laws, passing them and forcing them, down our throat that we were supposed to live by. And that's not the way it was, because that's just not how we were. So there was a lot of things that it was always one sided. It was never, the government said, oh, we put people there, they're supposed to serve and protect you. And that's not what happened. That didn't happen in the first place. So it was just, we were just in the way. That's what it was all about. I mean, like I said, when you go to relocation, there was a reason for that, and that was just to get them off where they were. Same thing, destroy their identity, because now you were forced not to speak your language. You were just forced into this other life that you didn't understand, and by not understanding it, what could you do? They didn't know how to farm. You didn't raise cattle, you didn't raise sheep. You were used to going out and gathering and fishing and hunting and taking care of your people. So it was just this. It's just like, like we talk about, they didn't. The tribes didn't want to live with each other, and it wasn't because we didn't like each other. It was just we were used to our own customs and our people. The ones we grew up with and the places we grew up, where you knew where to go pick berries, you knew where to gather food, you knew where to go fishing. But to take that away, it's just like us going to Europe or somewhere else, and all of a sudden we have a language barrier. We don't know where to go to, get things, or even a language to ask, where's the store, or where do we go? So that's kind of in their eyes what they were doing, and this was just a way to get it done. To me, this was just the easiest, what they thought was the easiest way to get it done.
This is a pretty difficult topic, difficult question to respond to to our viewers. This is going to be the truth of it is that it's really going to be painful to to talk about some of the details associated with boarding schools. Uh, the act. This is an extremely violent, very personally violent. It was a law designed by the federal government to 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 change the character and identity of the first people of this area, first people of Puget Sound. It was designed. That's what it was meant to do. The intent was to eliminate the language, eliminate the culture, eliminate the history, eliminate the spiritual ties to these beautiful watersheds, these beautiful coastlines, Puget Sound coastlines, these beautiful lake systems, and any of these tributaries that fed into these water systems. These were unique areas that were beautiful, pristine, and generous. Mother Nature knew what she was doing. She really created a beautiful paradise, if you will, in this Puget Sound region. And in order to get to that paradise, in order to capitalize on those resources, the federal government and the immigrants that wanted to call this place home, needed to get the natives out of the way, and this was one way to do it, without without literally putting a musket ball in the heads of these people. So this was a way to do it legally without with little to no attention from the immigrants that wanted this land, and the corporations and the big business, the big timber industries, the railroads, and the people that wanted to establish these big, huge cities. Well, this was how you got the first people out of the way, was to take an entire generation and mold them into someone that they're not. Do away with their language, do away with their culture, make it illegal, and prevent them from from recognizing their own traditional hereditary family name, and give them a Christian name. Take that title away from them. Prevent them from these arranged marriages, because we knew better to marry our own relative. We knew better to marry someone that was pretty close, a first, second, third cousin, even a fourth cousin. So it was, we knew that was wrong, and so now we're locked into these landlocked villages where we can't go anywhere and do anything and exercise our own culture and our own efforts to feed our own people and to name our own people and to live our own lives. So now we've got this institution, which is part of this plan to eliminate this entire culture, to make room for these recipients of 160 acres, recipients of 320 acres. It's just a horrible act, and a horrible effort by the federal government to really make it more convenient for Manifest Destiny.
Squaxin Island is about 5 miles long, 2 miles wide, and there's not real water on the island to drink. And if there is some, it's intermittent. And it has a lot to do with how much rain comes down and how much of the water can puddle into like a well. Other wells that were dug were brackish and not good to drink from. When the under the Treaty of 1854, there was a school established on Squaxin Island, and they thought because most of the tribal people of the Medicine Creek Nation could easily send their children to the school, but no, it was rather tough for the families because it meant the children would have to stay in the island. Just was not a real good place for children, and a lot of children died. We have burial grounds on the island, and we are so sad to say that a lot of they were children. And so after realizing the school on the island was not a good fit, it was transferred to the mainland where there was water and there was good food. And our people would be sent at a certain age to different schools, and they were boarding schools. The purpose of the Indian boarding school had a lot to do with assimilation, a lot to bring the tribal people into the non-native way of life. And so the tribal people would forget their language, forget their stories, and learn to live in the non-native world, and probably eventually move from the tribal reservations and from the families. The assimilation was devastating. There was a quote by, I think, Theodore Roosevelt. He was talking about the Allotment Act and how it kind of tried to assimilate our people. And he said, the Allotment Act is a mighty pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass. It acts directly upon family and the individual. I look at the boarding schools also in that same light, that it separated the children from the teachings of the ancestors and the ways of the people. It was a different type of education. Among our tribal people, we had many scholars, doctors, lawyers that understood the laws of the land and how to deal with people. And our people understood the medicines of the land. There were pharmaceutical lands that our people could get the medicines for, or food that would treat any type of illness that people might have. And we also were a culture here in the Northwest, a culture of natural scientists. Many of our people understood the changes of the season and how that would impact who we are, that was living close to the natural resources and watching the changes of the season, how that there comes a time of dormant where the plants go to sleep, and how the daylight changes, tide even impacts, tide changes. Our people understood the natural science of the land, and there was a different type of education, the Native American, indigenous type of education that addressed the holistic health of people. Then you had the non-native that filled everybody with different teachings from a non-native society. And some of them were good, and some of them were like moved us further and further away from really believing what our ancestors were teaching us. And these teachings were generations upon generations of watching and learning and studying. One of the elders, he said, whenever we step out into the great outdoors, we are stepping into the greatest classroom the Creator has ever given us. We, no matter how old we are, we should always be ready to watch, look, and learn and listen. And even to this day, we have many tribal people who some people believe are uneducated, but once you start talking to them, they have this amazing ability with critical thinking and understanding complexities. And so there is that difference between Western and Native education.
I mean, the purpose was to divide young people so that, whatever religious sect came to the area, and this was nationwide, so that they could save these children. And it's like the missionary belief that, we're Christianizing these children, and we're going to save their soul. They're heathens, they're savages, they need to be saved. I mean, that's really a big part of why so many people came to America in the first place, was, organized religion and the expansion of that. And it's my understanding, and this is how my grandma has always told us, and this is how her mom told her, was that when boarding schools were established, there was basically, think of a hat full of a bunch of names of different tribes in different locations, and that was kind of how each religious denomination was picked, how they went where they went. So basically, you're drawing a name out of a hat. And so we had the Presbyterian that drew Puyallup, and here at Puyallup, it was a government-run school. It was government paid, like it operated, and financial all came from the U.S. government as part of our treaty. That's part of the treaty, was education, and so they brought education out here, and that's how we got Presbyterian. That was how they found us. And you have to also understand that the people that were coming to work at this school, because it got really big, Puyallup Indian Trade School was a very large school, and the way that the people came to work there, they weren't like good people, right? They weren't like, I'm going to go save these children and I'm going to teach them how to be good Christians. They came here because nobody else wanted them. I mean, that was really the way that even in the Catholic and the other religious denominations that ran Indian boarding schools. And they, if something happened, they'd send them off to another boarding school. This happened a lot up in Canada as well. There was, you'd get Irish priests that would come and they would touch children. And if instead of like saying, no, that's not okay, or you're done, you're not going anywhere else, they'd send them somewhere else so that they, this terrible affliction wouldn't be pointed out. Unfortunately, we had two boarding schools here at Puyallup because the Catholics says, well, we can't have the Presbyterians have a school and run it and teach these children. So they were just on the outskirts of the Puyallup reservation. My understanding is that you weren't able to have more than one boarding school on reservation. So they were just outside of the reservation.
St. George's boarding school, Father Hylabos being the first principal, I guess you could say, of the school, superintendent. So we had those two right there. So, I mean, Nisqually, Puyallup, Muckleshoot, Squaxin, we had to deal with two boarding schools right off the bat. But I know Tulalip had one up north, and then Chumawa down south in Portland kind of emptied those out. And then there's one out, I think Spokane, the Spokane tribe out Kalispell area had one as well. So, but half of the boarding schools for Puget Sound were located right here on the Medicine Creek Treaty lands. So Puyallup, Nisqually, Muckleshoot, and Squaxin. We had a double dose on our reservations because of that.
So initially, when the boarding school was opened here at Puyallup, it was the Puyallup Indian Trade School. And it wasn't until 1910 or thereabout when we had a Congressman Cushman who pushed to get funding to save the school. The school was going to close down. There wasn't enough attendees. There had been a smallpox outbreak. There had been a lot of different things that had happened that were basically threatening the student population. And so he had pushed for some funding to keep the school going, and then the school was changed to Cushman boarding school in his honor. So, and there, yeah, Cushman was an interesting fellow, but that was where the name Cushman came from, and that name still follows us today. We do have people that don't realize the history and who Cushman was, and why are we calling our cemetery Cushman Cemetery, and why is it Cushman Hospital? And so we really are trying to kind of lean back on the Puyallup Indian Trade School, which is the majority. I mean, like really the 50 years or so prior to becoming the Cushman boarding school, it was the Puyallup Indian Trade School.
They were military schools. You had to be up at a certain time. You had to eat meals at a certain time. You had a certain time to eat meals. You had to do certain things. You had to pray. You had to exercise. Everything was very regimented. You didn't get to do anything on your own unless you were told to do so. You'd had your classrooms, you had your classes, you would do your homework, do your lessons, I guess, instead of homework, but lessons. And then you had to go learn how to be servants. They weren't teaching us how to be businessmen or businesswomen. They weren't teaching us how to sharpen our skills or anything. They were teaching us how to do laundry. The women were learned how to be proper servants to people that they will go serve, right? The men were trained how to do labor work that settlers didn't want to do. So carpentry, that, although the trade stuff, that was not so popular. And then you would say your prayers again and do Christian classes and seminary type stuff. And then you had to be in bed by a certain time. Oh, and by the way, if you even tried to speak your language, even tried to talk to a relative, you were beaten, you were raped, you were molested, you were stalked, you were murdered, you were put in cages. This was military style. We were prisoners of war, but now the prisoners of war in this instance were from the ages of 6 to 18, with the bulk of them being 6 to 12. So it wasn't. We think about our school days today, where we're sending our kids off and they get recess and they get school lunches, and they're somewhat edible, I guess. Depends on the menu for my kids. They tell me sometimes it's not edible, but the food, for instance, at boarding schools was nothing. It was mush. It was mutton, right? It was flour and water, and on good days you got bread, right? Those were So I mean, they gave them the poorest quality of food. They gave them drinks, with the littlest water they could. So you think it's nothing like what we imagine, but it's everything that we imagine when it comes to what would the worst case scenario you could send a kid to school, and that's what they had to endure. At Puyallup, we call these our children warriors. These were the grandkids of the Treaty War warriors. This was that following generation, so their grandkids. Luckily, they inherited that tenacity of our Treaty War warriors. Each one of us here on this panel are here today because of that tenacity, that desire to survive, that ability to survive. They had to endure the worst conditions, and they did it. And despite all that, they still practiced their language. They still practiced their culture. At night, they would sing their songs. In secret, they would talk to each other and keep those familiar relations.
The general idea was to really save these children, and they were isolated. My grandma has talked about about how we had some children that were sickly that weren't able to go to boarding school, so they didn't want to care for them in the boarding school, so they were able to stay home. And her idea is that those are our language, you know, knowledge keepers, is that they didn't have to go through what their cohort went through. You know, they had their own things going on, but they helped to keep that language alive because it wasn't taken from them. It wasn't beaten out of them. It wasn't forced that they had to stop speaking the language.
You think about if I had a sister, if I was in boarding school and I had a sister, I couldn't talk to her because if they knew that we were family, they would ship her off. If they knew you had any type of relationship with somebody else, you were separated. So we were all individually having to survive and pretend that we didn't know each other. And some kids did come from faraway reservations, faraway lands, and so we really didn't know them. But they practiced their songs at night. They talked to each other in their language when they weren't around. Because if you were, again, you were treated horrifically if they caught you speaking your language. If you used your name, if you, like Warren had alluded to, if you tried to carry on that history, that knowledge of who you were beaten for it. And a lot of kids died. A lot of kids didn't survive boarding school because they refused to give it up, and they paid the ultimate price. But each of us are here today because of those who survived, who endured all that. That's why we call them our warriors. They're our children warriors, our ancestral children warriors. And we revere them for that up here. Not just the Puyallup, but every one of us in Native country, across Indian country. You know, and that's why I'm glad that these stories are coming out. Deb Halen did that, required that those studies be done, this information be found out. We had those children burials discovered up in Canada. We had children burials discovered here at St. George's on the Puyallup Reservation. It's all starting to come to light. And I'm glad that these stories are starting to come out because these stories need to be told.
If you go back and you understand the tribal culture, and I get it sometimes with families. So, you know, we had extended families. You know, it's like Warren's got all his grandkids. But that's how life was. You know, that's how life was all the time. And in each of these households, everybody had a role. You know, you had the ones that the men hunted fish, the women gathered, you know, they built canoes. So it was usually your elders that were the teachers, you know, and it was this oral history. That was our schooling. That was their schooling. You know, today now we go to all of these culture classes that we're relearning things that we weren't taught because of what happened to us with boarding schools and taking away that identity. So once you see that, that was our schooling. But for a non-Indian to come in and not understand that, they're like, why are all these people living together? You know, why, you know, they never understood the roles of everybody in that household. So then it's like, okay, we're going to civilize them and we're going to educate them. So now you are forced, you are not, you know, given a choice. You are forced to go to these, you are forced to send your kids to these schools. And when you look at it, think about it, you know, you're taking, you know, our life's blood away by, you know, I can't even imagine today having my kids, my nieces, my nephews taken away. And, you know, one of the federal government wanted was, okay, now you're taking away their identity because now they don't have that family unit, you know, so what are they going to do? Now they're not going to be these ones that are the descendants of this land that they're trying to take, you know. So now by splitting them up, by taking away their language, you know, like that, their whole tribal identity, now you've got them down to almost like on those internment camps. You know, you're back to being held hostage. You know, they figured out, and when Brandon talks about the military, that was the military tactic. That's a tactic you get from the military on how you do these things. So that's what they were looking at. So you look at Stevens, he came from West Point. That was his whole, he understood that. He understood this is how you make these things happen, by splitting all this up, by taking away. So that was their tactic to force all of that out. So when you're shipped to these other boarding schools that are farther away, I know a lot of them, my relations that went to boarding schools, the aunts, and, they would talk about it. We'd just run away, but they were close enough that they could. Well, you look at some of these that weren't close, what could they do? So this was all a military tactic to get all of this stuff away from tribes, so that there was no descendants left to claim to keep the reservations going, to keep their blood going, to keep all of these things going. That's kind of what they looked at it that way. So, for the parents, I so sympathize with them, because, to be threatened that you would go to jail if you did not send your kids to these boarding schools, and then they say in there that in that report, they would hold back rations. They were like, you're not going to get it unless you send your kids to school. I mean, that's the thing, like I said, everything that happened to us, it was always like Warren said, we were put in a corner, or we were between a rock and a hard place, in making these decisions. So you can see this trauma with the parents, with the kids, that were now, they're elderly now. A lot of them still talk about, and that's why it's hard to talk about, because you could just imagine being so traumatized that, I can't even speak it. I mean, there's things you don't talk about because it hurts so bad. And so now here we are, talking about this. And like you said, it's a difficult question, because, we talk about that, like, what Brandon talks about. They even talked about, like, my aunt, her son said, I know she was sterilized. They took her, medically. That was another thing they did to them, was that so you wouldn't have any more kids, but that's not talked about either, that these were some of the things. So there's a lot of things that happened in there that now are just coming out. And that's why I like the report, because it gives you that insight of some of the things that I didn't think of, that because not having these stories that were passed down, our own education, that's not what we knew, and we talk about just in the public education, you weren't taught any of this, you weren't taught about the Puget Sound Treaty War. You weren't taught, about all of these other things that happened to us. So this is just another thing that's not talked about that needs to come out, because it shows just how devastating it was. But for our ancestors, just like Leshai, and our grandparents, great grandparents, to sacrifice just so we could be here is so important to our next generation. It's I can't even explain to them how important that is, of what they would have went through just for them to be here. Just to them be alive and in a tribe.
This is definitely some very disturbing content. I mean, there are a number of podcasts that that might fit into this research or this conversation, and we could go on and on. We could spend several episodes talking about how horrific this chapter of our history is. But I like the way Brandon kind of summarized some of the expectations of our ancestors in that era, and Nettsie talking about the personal testimonial and what happened to her ancestors. One I guess really disturbing, one troubling I guess point of interest in this topic is that the children were denied access to their family, to their immediate family. And even in today, in 2024, it's April 5th, 2024, families are relatively tight, and not just with their children, but with their extended family. They're very close to their first cousins. They acknowledge them as brother and sister rather than cousin. second and third cousins are called immediate family. Third and fourth cousins are acknowledged as family, as relatives. And so, and from that explanation, you can you kind of get a sense of how tight knit Native families are to this day. So that that was never taught out of them during these during this boarding school chapter. That we maintained that was never beaten out of them. It was never trained out of them. And so they clearly it was miscalculated on this value, this Native value that we embrace to this very day. So we maintained that. That was something that was not extinguished during this boarding, which was one of the goals and objectives of boarding schools. So, just based on what I've read and what I've heard and what some of the elders, the way they've talked, was that, it was very regimented. It was very militant style, but with a religious tone. So in this religious tone, oftentimes is how these the people who ran these schools would use their disciplinary tactics. How they would use their beatings. They would say that you're going to get beat because maybe you didn't pray, or maybe you used the wrong English word, or maybe you weren't submissive enough. So you're going to get disciplined. And discipline came in many different ways, and you've heard some of them here. They were physically, they were mentally, and even sexually, sexual abuse. Or maybe you were denied a meal. Maybe you got locked up in the quiet room for a couple of days, say maybe 3 or 4 days, to teach you a lesson about your language, to teach you a lesson about your culture, to teach you a lesson about asking for certain things that you need. Well, that those stories are very true. Those testimonials. Why would somebody lie about that? Why would somebody embellish a story like that? I'm sure it happened. I have no doubt in my mind. So these atrocities that took place, it makes it all that much more difficult to talk about in great detail, because people don't want to hear about. They don't want to hear about how their wisdom tooth was taken out without any medication. They don't want to hear about bones that were broken and that were never properly set. They don't want to talk about how they were denied meals, and substandard meals at that, because what I've heard also is that in order to make these institutions run, oftentimes the food was often sold, and the meals that they were given were not palatable, were something that they refused to eat, and oftentimes would starve themselves because they couldn't take it in. It just, most natives are lactose intolerant, and they don't want to drink milk because it's gonna pass right through them. Most natives in those days didn't like the taste of cow, of beef, or they didn't like the taste of chicken. They liked fish. They liked deer and elk. And they liked the wild onion and the camas, chocolate lily. Their diet was really acclimated to Pacific Northwest traditional foods, and so having to turn all that around, just go the opposite direction, and forced to eat Brandon, I think it was you that mentioned, this water and flour, and make it palatable. People celebrate fry bread today, and I cringe every time, because every time I hear somebody say, "Oh, they make the best fry bread," but it brings me back to these stories about why our ancestors ate fry bread, because there was literally nothing else. All of the intended ingredients, all the intended menu items were sold off for the profit of these of missionaries, of these these farmers in charge, or these priests who were, given the responsibility to watch over these children. And so, these are hard truths that we need to acknowledge.
I think it gave them the justification they needed. They were doing it in the name of Christ. They had their justification. The Bible says I could do this. The Old Testament talks about it a lot. In the name of Christ, eliminating nations, right? Eliminating people who were not Christian. So I think they had it in their head, and then they had it in their understanding, and of that we were not Christians. And so therefore, when you're acting in the name of Christ, you can do whatever you want, and it's justified because you're doing it for a righteous cause, for what you deem as a righteous cause. Never mind that you're not looking at, they ignored the actual, what Christianity was, like that was not the case, but they were to justify it for themselves. And it became easier. It just became, the government could say, hey, it wasn't us. It was a Catholic church, so the government didn't want to get involved. And then the priests, they were justified because they were men of God. They were fulfilling their calling of Father Hylabos. I'm trying to remember the quote now, but Father Hylabos referred to us as sheep, and he was gathering sheep, and he was bringing the flock to Christ by whatever means he could do that. And because of that, no matter what happened to the kids, no matter how they treated us and our ancestors, it was justified. And so they wouldn't, when a child would die, when they were, during the disciplinary section, if they disciplined them so hard they died, well, it was the child's fault for not being strong enough, for the devil being in him so much that he couldn't live. The blame was never on themselves. They never had to take accountability because it was being done for Christianity. It's being done under a religious context. So they had it in their head that they could do these things and wouldn't have to face any type of accountability in this life or in the next life, because God would forgive them because they were doing it for the church. So when you have that, if you can do whatever you want and there's not going to be any problem. You look at kids. I have 5 kids, man. If there's no consequences, they'll do whatever they want. They'll have 5 bowls of cereal, Lucky Charms, right? They'll have 20 boxes of chocolate. And I think that was happening here. There was no consequences for these priests, for these nuns, or these religious men and women. So their inner, to put it in their terms, their inner sins that they struggled with now could come out. And they took it out on our children. They took it out on these young tribal members. And since they weren't having consequences, they could do whatever they wanted and got away with it.
We have stories of one of our tribal elders said he was just a little guy and he went to the school in Skokomish and he had to stay there. And he said that when he was there, he had a very bad earache. And they looked at his ear and eventually they tied it with a bandana and put medicine on his ear. And it didn't go away, so they had to send him to Cascadia to be looked at. And when the family had heard that he was going to go to Cascadia, they were so worried because they had heard that there were studies that were done on Native American Indian children that would go there. And he said, as a little guy, I picked up on that fear and I cried. And he said he made his ear hurt worse. And he said it was a traumatic time. And that's what he remembers being at the Squaxin Indian School.
Also, when you think back to the treaty, guys know I always harp on this treaty. It says in there you're guaranteed what? Medical, education, blah, blah, blah. So the best way for the government, federal government, to accomplish that was to disperse all of this and just wipe their hands of it. So it wasn't, let's go in and learn about these tribal people's culture, their ways, the way they are in life, all of this, which, the British never interfered. The British just came to trade. They were fine with them, never bothered, never forced, never did anything like that. But now you come with this United States federal government, all of a sudden, because we get back to the treaty with the land, and then, they make these promises. Well, how are you going to, handle that? You're going to provide education any way, any form you can. So when the churches reach out, it's like, sure, we'll give you the funding. You just do it. You take over. You can go to that reservation. We don't have to build schools on the reservation, which is the way it should have been. We will just give the money to them and they'll take care of it. And we don't care how it's done. But now we've fulfilled, we've checked the box. We talk about this all the time. And tribal government, how some agencies, it's like check the box and we've fulfilled our role. That's the same. That's a learned thing. And that's what's happened year after year after year. So when we get back to the treaty, it's the same thing. They didn't build medical facilities on the reservations. There's 3 reservations. They didn't do that. Where did they send us? To these places that traumatized me. I still have phobias with dentists. So, there's these things that happen that was just checking the box and fulfilling their role. They're part of that treaty that happened. And these religious, agencies, as I'll call them, just took it, because they could get funding wherever they wanted to go. And, the money was provided for them to do that, whether they built something or whether they just took over a building. And what you'll find in a lot of these schools, they took over old military buildings. They took over everything. So that was just fine for them. And then it's the same thing. You teach what you know or what you want to teach. And if you're the first one to get there, you get the money, you get the funding for it because you've now, you know, put this other one. They couldn't get that money and they couldn't come to this reservation because now you've got that. So that had, in my mind, that had a lot to do with that because this was just the way of the federal government checking the box saying, we've provided education, we've provided a way. So if it didn't happen, that's not on us, that's on, we've done all we can.
Yeah, I totally agree with Nettsie. This chapter or this effort by the federal government had, I guess it was one way that the federal government could address what's called Article 10 of the Medicine Creek Treaty, and that's the article that's the paragraph that promises education to the tribes and the tribe's children, and in this case, I think what happened is that the federal government didn't want to spend, thousands of dollars on a bona fide educator. In this case, what the federal government did was allow little to nothing, at the cost of little to nothing, to get this institution, this religious institution, to come in and allow them to fulfill their obligation or their version of their obligation to convert non-Christians to Christians. And in that, so what the Christians get is they get to, like Brandon said, they get to check this off their box, off their list, because look, I'm fulfilling my obligation. I'm converting these savages into good Christian people. And then, so that's a two bird, one stone sort of thing. And the federal government gets to say, well, we've fulfilled our obligation, like Nettsie said. We fulfilled our obligation. We've upheld our promise as in Article 10 of the Medicine Creek Treaty. So, and then thirdly, they get to make an effort to erase these traditional people, these humble traditional people who are taken for granted of, because they don't speak they're not fluent speakers of English, right? And their values are completely opposite of the natives. The natives' values are completely opposite of what European values are. So they really do get taken advantage of clearly by this education / religious conversion effort.
I do know that, at all of these boarding schools, these poor kids were told how fortunate they are, how fortunate you are that somebody's paying for your education. If you weren't here at this school, you'd have no education, and this is, going to save you and your future. And, other people have to pay to go to school, and beneficiaries give this to you. And really it just the idea that was a fabulous benefit in the way that it was done is pretty, that's pretty appalling.
Hey Shiba, Hisquo, for joining us for the Indigenous Voices podcast. Indigenous Voices is available wherever you get your podcast. Follow and subscribe at fortnisqually.org.
This podcast is generously supported by the Pierce County Historic Preservation Grant,
as well as representatives from Puyallup, Nisqually, Squaxin, and Bullchild.
Music by Vincent Johnson, Nooksack, Lummi, and Nishani Johnson, Jamestown, Sklallam, Lummi.